The situation escalated in mid-July when Linda discovered what she believed was her smoking gun. While researching property records at the county courthouse, she had found discrepancies in the legal descriptions of various lots in the neighborhood, including what appeared to be unclear boundaries around Tom's property. Armed with this information, she began building a case that the pool might be improperly located, possibly extending beyond the boundaries of Tom's lot and into what she assumed was community or county-owned land. Linda spent hours walking the neighborhood, with a measuring tape and clipboard trying to determine exact property lines and taking photographs of what she considered to be evidence of boundary violations. She enlisted the help of 2 other HOA board members who were impressed by her thorough research and growing convinced that she had uncovered a serious issue that needed to be addressed. The fact that Tom was the sheriff actually worked against him in some ways, as Linda argued that he should be held to an even higher standard when it came to following rules and regulations. The breaking point came on a sweltering afternoon in late July when temperatures had climbed above 95 degrees and the humidity made it feel even hotter. Tom had come home early from what had been a particularly difficult day involving a multi-car accident and a domestic dispute that had required several hours to resolve safely. All he wanted was to change out of his uniform and cool off in his pool before trying to relax for the evening. As he was settling into the water for what he hoped would be a peaceful swim, Tom heard raised voices coming from the direction of the street. Linda was standing in his front yard with 2 other women, who Tom recognized as fellow HOA board members, and they appeared to be having an animated discussion, while pointing toward his backyard. Their voices carried clearly across the yard, and Tom could hear enough of their conversation to understand that they were debating the best way to handle what Linda kept referring to as a clear violation of community standards and possibly county regulations. Tom tried to ignore the commotion and focus on his swimming, but the voices grew louder and more agitated as the women worked. They had themselves up over what they saw as a serious problem that demanded immediate action. Linda was clearly the ringleader, pushing her companions to take a more aggressive stance and arguing that Tom's position as sheriff made his alleged violations even more serious, since he should be setting an example for the community. Finally, unable to concentrate on relaxing with the ongoing disturbance, Tom climbed out of the pool and walked to the edge of his property line where he could address the women directly. "Is there something I can help you with?" he called out, his voice carrying the authority that came naturally after years of law enforcement, but still maintaining a professional tone. Linda immediately stepped forward, as if she had been waiting for this opportunity to confront him directly. "Sheriff Mitchell," she announced in a voice loud enough to be heard by anyone in the surrounding houses, "we need to discuss this pool situation immediately. After extensive research and consultation with other board members, we have determined that your pool installation violates multiple HOA regulations and quite possibly county zoning laws." Tom felt his jaw tighten as he realized that Linda was deliberately creating a public spectacle rather than attempting to resolve whatever concerns she had through normal channels. "What specific violations are you alleging?" he asked, keeping his voice level despite his growing irritation. Linda consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision, as if she were presenting evidence in a courtroom. First, she announced the pool was installed without proper notification to the HOA board as required by our community guidelines. Second, the lighting and water features create noise and visual pollution that disrupts the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties. Third, and most importantly, our research indicates that the pool extends beyond your property boundaries onto land that belongs to the community or county. The accusation about property boundaries was what finally pushed Tom past his limit for patience. He had been dealing with Linda's petty complaints and passive-aggressive behavior for weeks, but questioning the legal ownership of his land crossed a line that he could not ignore. "That is completely false," he said, his voice taking on the firm tone he used when dealing with suspects who were not being truthful. "My property boundaries are clearly established in the county records, and the pool is entirely within those boundaries." Linda smiled triumphantly, as if his denial was exactly what she had been hoping to hear. "Well, see about that," she replied. "In fact, I'm so confident in our research that I'm prepared to call the authorities to investigate this matter immediately. Someone needs to hold you accountable, Sheriff Mitchell, even if you think your position gives you special privileges." Before Tom could respond, Linda had pulled out her cell phone and was already dialing. She turned slightly away from him as if to prevent him from hearing her conversation, but spoke loudly enough that her words carried clearly across the yard. "Yes, I'd like to report a possible zoning violation and illegal construction," she said into the phone. "We have a resident who has built a swimming pool that extends beyond his property boundaries, and he refuses to acknowledge the violations." Tom watched in disbelief as Linda continued her phone call, providing what she claimed was evidence of multiple violations and requesting that officers be dispatched immediately to investigate the situation. The other HOA board members stood beside her, nodding in agreement, and occasionally adding their own comments about the need for enforcement and accountability. The entire scene felt surreal to Tom, who had never imagined that his peaceful home would become the center of such a ridiculous controversy. What Linda did not know, and what would soon become apparent to everyone involved, was that her call was being routed directly to the county sheriff's department, where Tom served as the highest ranking officer. The dispatcher who answered the call recognized the address immediately and knew exactly who lived at that location. More importantly, the dispatcher knew that any complaint involving the sheriff's personal property would need to be handled with particular care and attention to proper procedures. As Linda continued her animated phone conversation, Tom could see several neighbors beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion and curious about what was happening. The situation was rapidly becoming the kind of public spectacle that he had always tried to avoid, preferring to keep his personal life separate from his professional responsibilities. He also knew that Linda's accusations were not only false but demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of property ownership and legal boundaries that was about to become embarrassingly apparent. The irony of the situation was not lost on Tom, as he watched Linda demand immediate law enforcement response to investigate the very person who was responsible for coordinating law enforcement in the county. Her research had been thorough in some ways, but completely inadequate in others, missing crucial information that would have prevented this embarrassing confrontation. Most importantly, she had failed to understand that the land she believed was being violated actually belonged to Tom himself, having been purchased through a series of carefully documented transactions over many years. As Linda finished her phone call and turned back toward him with a satisfied expression, Tom realized that the time for patient diplomacy had passed. The situation was about to resolve itself in a way that would be educational for Linda and entertaining for the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the drama unfold. He settled back against his pool fence and prepared to wait for the arrival of the officers who would soon discover exactly who they had been called to investigate. The afternoon sun continued to beat down mercilessly as the group waited for law enforcement to arrive, but Tom felt a sense of calm settling over him for the first time in weeks. Soon, all of Linda's accusations and harassment would be exposed for what they truly were, and he could return to enjoying his property in peace. The only question was whether Linda would learn from this experience or find new ways to create problems for herself and others in the community. Within 15 minutes of Linda's phone call, the distinctive sound of car doors closing could be heard from the front of the house, followed by the measured footsteps of officers walking up the driveway. Tom recognized the voices immediately, as Deputy Martinez and Deputy Johnson, both experienced officers who had worked under his supervision for several years. They would handle the situation professionally and thoroughly, ensuring that all proper procedures were followed despite the unusual circumstances of investigating their own boss. Linda straightened her shoulders and arranged her clipboard as she prepared to present her case to what she assumed would be sympathetic law enforcement officers. She had clearly expected this moment to be her vindication, when outside authorities would confirm her research and force Tom to acknowledge his violations. The confidence in her expression suggested that she believed she was about to witness the humbling of someone who had dismissed her concerns and challenged her authority. Tom remained quietly by his pool fence, watching as his deputies approached the group of women with professional courtesy but obvious curiosity about the nature of the complaint they had been called to investigate. The next few minutes would determine whether Linda would finally understand the extent of her miscalculations or continue to push forward with accusations that were about to be thoroughly debunked by people who knew the real facts about property ownership boundaries, and legal authority in Willowbrook. The deputies emerged around the corner of the house with their notebooks ready and their expressions showing the careful neutrality that came with years of experience handling neighborhood disputes. Deputy Martinez stepped forward as the senior officer, while Deputy Johnson positioned himself slightly to the side, where he could observe the entire group and take notes as necessary. Both men had clearly been briefed on the unusual nature of this call and were prepared to handle the situation with appropriate professionalism, despite the awkward circumstances. "Good afternoon," Linda called out before the deputies could introduce themselves or begin their investigation. "Thank you so much for responding quickly to this serious situation. I am Linda Patterson, member of the Willowbrook HOA Board, and these are my fellow board members, Janet Wheeler and Margaret Collins. We have documented multiple violations by this resident, and we need your help to ensure proper enforcement of community standards and county regulations." Deputy Martinez nodded politely while scanning the scene and making note of Tom standing calmly by the pool area. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about possible zoning violations and improper construction," he said in the measured tone that officers used when gathering information. "Can you tell us specifically what violations you're alleging and what evidence you have to support those claims?" Linda immediately launched into her prepared presentation, consulting her clipboard and pointing toward various areas of Tom's property. As she outlined her research and conclusions, she explained her concerns about improper HOA notification, inadequate documentation, and most importantly, her belief that the pool extended beyond Tom's property boundaries onto land that belonged to the community or county. Her presentation was thorough and confident, suggesting that she had spent considerable time preparing for this moment. As Linda spoke, Deputy Johnson was taking careful notes while Deputy Martinez listened attentively and occasionally asked clarifying questions about specific claims. Both officers maintained professional expressions that gave no indication of their thoughts about the validity of the complaints or their knowledge of the electoral actual facts regarding property ownership and boundaries. They were following proper procedures for investigating any complaint, regardless of who was involved or how unusual the circumstances might be. When Linda finished her presentation, Deputy Martinez thanked her for the detailed information and explained that they would need to investigate the claims thoroughly before reaching any conclusions. He asked if she had any additional documentation or evidence that might be relevant to their investigation, and she eagerly provided copies of her research, including property maps, measurements, and photographs that she believed supported her position. "Now," Deputy Martinez said, turning toward Tom, "we need to speak with the property owner about these allegations. Are you the owner of this property, and can you provide documentation of your ownership and any permits related to the pool construction?" Tom stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what the investigation would reveal. "Yes, I am the property owner," he replied, "and all the necessary documentation, including the original deed surveys of the property boundaries and all permits related to the pool construction. The pool was built 3 years ago with proper county permits, and all work was performed by licensed contractors according to approved plans." Linda interjected before Tom could continue, clearly frustrated by what she saw as his continued denial of obvious violations. "Officer," she said, addressing Deputy Martinez with an urgent tone, "the research clearly shows that his property boundaries do not extend far enough to include the entire pool area. The land behind his house belongs to the county, or possibly the HOA, and he has no right to build on that property without permission." Deputy Martinez nodded seriously, as if considering her argument, while Deputy Johnson continued taking notes. "Ma'am, these are serious allegations," he said, "and we will certainly investigate them thoroughly. Property boundary disputes can be complex legal matters that require careful examination of all relevant documentation and surveys." He turned back to Tom with an expression that revealed nothing about his knowledge of the true situation. "Sir, do you have current surveys or other documentation that would establish the exact boundaries of your property? We will need to verify the location of all structures in relation to those boundaries before we can determine whether any violations have occurred." Tom nodded and gestured toward his house. "All the documentation is inside," he said. I can provide the original deed, the most recent survey, and all permits and inspections related to the pool construction. I think you will find that everything is in proper order and that all structures are well within the established property boundaries. As Tom walked toward his house to retrieve the documentation, Linda turned to the deputies with renewed confidence. "Officers," she said, "I hope you will be thorough in your investigation because this situation has been going on for weeks. Despite my attempts to resolve it through normal channels, as a member of the HOA board, I have a responsibility to ensure that all residents comply with community standards and county regulations, regardless of their position or influence in the community." The implication in her words was clear, and both deputies understood that she was suggesting that Tom's position as sheriff might have influenced previous decisions or allowed him to avoid proper oversight. Deputy Martinez maintained his professional expression, but exchanged a brief glance with his partner that suggested they were both aware of the irony in her statement. Tom returned from the house, carrying a folder containing all the relevant documentation, including copies of the original land purchase agreements, surveys conducted over the years, and all permits related to the pool construction. He handed the folder to Deputy Martinez and stepped back to allow the officers to review the materials without interference. As Deputy Martinez began examining the documents, his expression gradually changed from neutral professionalism to something that looked almost like suppressed amusement. Deputy Johnson moved closer to look over his partner's shoulder, and Tom could see both men struggling to maintain their composure as they realized the full extent of Linda's miscalculations. The survey documents told a story that was far different from what Linda had assumed based on her amateur research. Not only was the pool entirely within Tom's property boundaries, but those boundaries extended much farther than anyone in the neighborhood realized. The deed showed that Tom owned nearly 40 acres, including all of the wooded area behind his house, the creek that ran through the neighborhood, and substantial portions of what most residents assumed was public land. Deputy Martinez looked up from the documents with an expression that was carefully controlled but could not entirely hide his amazement at what he had discovered. "Sir," he said, "these documents appear to show that you own significantly more property than just the residential lot where your house is located. Can you confirm that this survey accurately reflects your current property boundaries?" Tom nodded calmly, though he could see Linda beginning to look uncertain as she realized that the investigation was not proceeding as she had expected. "That is correct," he said. "Over the years, I have purchased additional parcels as they became available, including the wooded area and creek bed that extend well beyond what appears to be my backyard. The pool is located entirely on my property with plenty of room to spare." Linda stepped forward with her clipboard raised, as if she were about to present additional evidence, but her confidence was clearly shaken. "That cannot be right," she said, though her voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. "My research clearly shows that the land behind these houses is public property or belongs to the county. There must be some mistake in those documents, Deputy." Martinez consulted the survey again before responding with careful precision. "Ma'am, according to these official county records, the property boundaries are clearly established and properly documented. The pool and all related structures appear to be well within the legal boundaries of the owner's property. There do not appear to be any zoning violations or boundary disputes based on this documentation." The realization of what was happening began to dawn on Linda as she processed the implications of the deputy's findings. Her research had been flawed from the beginning based on assumptions about property ownership that were completely incorrect. Not only was she wrong about the boundary violations, but she had made her accusations in the most public way possible, ensuring that her mistake would be witnessed by neighbors and documented by law enforcement. "But wait," Linda said desperately, consulting her clipboard as if it might contain information that would salvage her position. "What about the HOA violations and the failure to provide proper notification about the pool construction? Those are still valid concerns that need to be addressed regardless of the property boundary issue." Deputy Johnson looked up from his notes with an expression that suggested he was trying to be helpful despite the awkward situation. "Ma'am," he said, "HOA violations are civil matters that would typically be handled through the association itself rather than law enforcement. Unless there are criminal activities or violations of county ordinances involved, we generally do not investigate. Internal community disputes, moreover, Deputy Martinez added after consulting the permit documentation. The pool construction appears to have been properly permitted and inspected according to county requirements. All the necessary approvals were obtained, and the work was completed according to approved plans. We do not see any violations of county regulations or zoning requirements. Linda stood in stunned silence as the full impact of the situation became clear to her. Not only were her accusations completely unfounded, but she had called law enforcement to investigate someone who turned out to own far more property than she had imagined. Her careful research had been based on faulty assumptions and incomplete information, leading her to make a public spectacle that would likely become neighborhood legend. The other HOA board members who had supported Linda's campaign against Tom began to distance themselves, both physically and verbally, as they realized they had been drawn into a situation that was rapidly becoming embarrassing for everyone involved. Janet Wheeler and Margaret Collins exchanged uncomfortable glances as they understood that their association with Linda's accusations would reflect poorly on their judgment and credibility within the community. Tom maintained his calm demeanor throughout the investigation, but he could not entirely suppress a sense of satisfaction as he watched Linda struggled to come to terms with the collapse of her carefully constructed case. For weeks she had harassed him with petty complaints and veiled threats, culminating in this public confrontation that she had clearly expected to be her moment of triumph. Instead, it had become a demonstration of the dangers of making assumptions. Without having complete information, Deputy Martinez closed the folder containing Tom's documentation and handed it back to him with a professional nod. "Sir," he said, "everything appears to be in proper order, and we do not find any evidence of violations or improper construction. The pool and related structures are clearly within your property boundaries, and all county requirements appear to have been met during the construction process." He turned to address Linda and the other HOA board members with the same professional courtesy he had shown throughout the investigation. "Ladies, based on our review of the documentation and physical evidence, we do not find any violations of county regulations or zoning requirements. The pool construction appears to have been properly permitted and completed according to approved plans. Any concerns about HOA regulations would need to be addressed through your association rather than law enforcement." Linda opened her mouth as if to protest further, but seemed to realize that any additional arguments would only make her situation worse. The evidence was clear and undeniable, and continuing to press her case would only draw more attention to her mistakes. She nodded stiffly and stepped back toward her companions, who were clearly eager to leave the scene as quickly as possible. As the deputies prepared to leave, Tom thanked them for their thorough investigation and professional handling of the situation. Both men nodded respectfully, though Tom could see them struggling not to smile at the irony of having been called to investigate their own sheriff for violations that turned out to be completely imaginary. The small crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the drama began to disperse, with many of them stopping to offer Tom's supportive comments about the harassment he had endured and expressions of amazement about the extent of his property ownership. Several neighbors mentioned that they had always wondered who owned the wooded area and creek, and were pleased to learn that it belonged to someone who would preserve its natural character. Linda and her companions retreated to her house with as much dignity as they could muster, but their hurried departure and avoided eye contact made it clear that they understood the magnitude of their mistake. The investigation had not only cleared Tom of any wrongdoing, but had revealed information about property ownership that completely undermined the foundation of Linda's complaints. As the sun began to set, Tom finally had the peaceful evening he had been hoping for when he first came home from work. The pool area was quiet again, with only the gentle sound of the waterfall feature and the natural sounds of the woods that surrounded his property. The confrontation had been stressful and unnecessary, but it had also resolved the ongoing harassment in a way that would likely prevent future problems with Linda or other overzealous HOA board members. The following days brought a steady stream of neighbors stopping by to apologize for the disruption and to express their appreciation for having Tom as a member of the community. Many residents mentioned that they had been uncomfortable with Linda's aggressive approach to HOA enforcement, but had not known how to address their concerns without creating additional conflict. The failed investigation had effectively discredited her methods and reduced her influence within the organization. Tom returned to his routine of morning swims and evening relaxation by the pool, but now he did so with the knowledge that his privacy and property rights had been officially confirmed by law enforcement. The documentation review had also prompted him to have his property lines professionally marked, which eliminated any future confusion about boundaries and made it clear to everyone exactly how much land he owned. Linda remained in the neighborhood, but her behavior changed dramatically after the failed investigation. She continued to participate in HOA activities, but with much less enthusiasm and none of the aggressive enforcement tactics that had characterized her early months in Willowbrook. The other board members began to take a more measured approach to community issues, learning from the embarrassing example of what could happen when assumptions were made without proper research. The incident became a cautionary tale within the neighborhood about the importance of understanding property rights and following proper procedures when addressing concerns about community standards. It also demonstrated the value of having complete information before making accusations that could damage relationships and create unnecessary conflict within the community. For Tom, the resolution of the conflict meant that he could finally enjoy his property without the constant scrutiny and harassment that had made his home feel less like a sanctuary and more like a source of stress. The pool remained his favorite place to unwind after difficult days at work, and the knowledge that his privacy was legally protected allowed him to fully relax in the peaceful setting he had worked so hard to create. The creek continued to flow gently through his property, providing a home for wildlife and a source of natural beauty that he was committed to preserving for future generations. The woods remained undeveloped and accessible to the deer and other animals that had lived there long before the neighborhood was built, ensuring that this small piece of nature would continue to thrive within the growing suburban community. As the summer turned to fall, Tom reflected on the lessons learned from his conflict with Linda and the importance of standing up for his rights while maintaining his professional integrity. The situation had tested his patience and diplomacy, but had ultimately been resolved through proper legal channels without compromising his position or principles. It had also strengthened his relationships with his neighbors and colleagues who had witnessed his calm handling of a difficult situation. The pool project that had started as a simple desire for a cool place to relax had become the center of a community drama that revealed important truths about property ownership, legal procedures, and the dangers of making assumptions without complete information. In the end, it had brought the neighborhood closer together while establishing clear boundaries, both literally and figuratively, that would help prevent similar conflicts in the future. Tom continued to serve as sheriff with the same dedication and professionalism that had earned him the respect of his community and colleagues. The incident with Linda had demonstrated his commitment to following proper procedures even when he was the subject of investigation, and had reinforced his reputation as someone who could be trusted to handle difficult situations with fairness and integrity. The lessons learned from the pool controversy extended beyond the immediate neighborhood as word of the incident spread through law enforcement circles and local government offices. It became an example of how property disputes should be handled through proper legal channels, and how important it is to have complete and accurate information before making accusations that could have serious consequences. Years later, Tom would still occasionally encounter Linda at community events or neighborhood gatherings, but their interactions remained polite and distant. She had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of thorough research and proper procedures, while Tom had gained a deeper appreciation for the privacy and security that his property provided. The pool continued to be his favorite retreat, a place where he could leave behind the stresses of his demanding job and enjoy the peace and quiet of his own piece of paradise. The incident had also had positive effects on the HOA itself, as the organization adopted more careful procedures for investigating complaints and addressing community concerns. The board members became more thoughtful about their approach to enforcement and more respectful of property rights and individual privacy. The community as a whole became stronger and more cohesive as residents learned to communicate more effectively and resolve disputes through proper channels rather than public confrontations. In the end, what had started as a harassment campaign against Tom's pool had become a catalyst for positive change throughout the neighborhood. Property boundaries were clarified, legal procedures were better understood, and community relationships were strengthened through the shared experience of witnessing how conflicts should and should not be handled. The pool itself remained exactly as it had always been, a source of relaxation and enjoyment, that it was completely legal, properly constructed, and entirely within the boundaries of land that Tom had every right to own and develop. The transformation of Linda from an aggressive enforcer to a more measured community member demonstrated that people could learn from their mistakes and change their behavior when confronted with clear evidence of their errors. While the initial conflict had been unpleasant and unnecessary, the ultimate resolution had created a more harmonious community where property rights were respected and disputes were handled through appropriate channels. Tom never regretted building his pool or purchasing the additional land that had given him the privacy and natural setting he valued so much. The investment in his property had not only provided him with personal enjoyment, but it also preserved a peace, a natural habitat that might otherwise have been developed. His quiet stewardship of the land had benefited the entire community. By maintaining the wooded areas and creek that added so much to the neighborhood's character and appeal. The story of the pool controversy became part of neighborhood lore passed down to new residents as an example of what could happen when assumptions were made without proper research. It served as a reminder that every property had a history and legal documentation that needed to be understood before complaints were filed or accusations were made. Most importantly, it demonstrated that conflicts could be resolved peacefully and professionally when proper procedures were followed and all parties were committed to finding the truth rather than simply winning an argument. As Tom settled into his evening routine of floating peacefully in his pool while watching the stars appear overhead, he felt grateful for the resolution of the conflict and the lessons it had taught everyone involved. The water was cool and refreshing, the night air was filled with the sounds of nature, and his property provided exactly the kind of sanctuary he had envisioned when he first decided to build his private retreat. The harassment and accusations had been temporary inconveniences, but his enjoyment of the pool and his ownership of the land were permanent sources of satisfaction that would continue for years to come. Ms. Running overtime. Sheriff Tom Mitchell had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift dealing with domestic disputes and traffic accidents when he pulled into the driveway of his summer heat had been relentless that year, making the concrete sidewalks shimmer like mirages and turning front lawns into patches of brown despite the best efforts of sprinkler. Sistis Ranch-style home on Maple Ridge Drive. The house sat on a corner lot that backed up to a small wooded area, giving him the privacy he craved after spending his days surrounded by people and their problems. Tom had lived in Willowbrook for nearly 20 years, first as a deputy, then working his way up to a sheriff. He knew every street, every family, and most importantly, every piece of land in the county by heart. His property was special, though not just because it was his sanctuary, but because he owned far more than most people realized. The deed to his land extended well beyond what appeared to be his backyard, encompassing nearly 40 acres that stretched deep into the woods and included the small creek that wound through the neighborhood. Most residents assumed the land belonged to the city or was part of some nature preserve, but Tom had quietly purchased it piece by piece over the years, whenever adjacent lots came up for sale. The idea for the pool had come to him during another scorching summer 3 years prior. Working long hours in the heat while wearing a full uniform and bulletproof vest had taken its toll, and he found himself dreaming of cool water and peaceful evenings floating under the stars. He spent months researching contractors and designs, eventually settling on a modest in-ground pool with a small waterfall feature that would blend naturally with the wooded backdrop of his property. The entire project had been completed with proper permits and inspections, though Tom had kept the details quiet, preferring to avoid the kind of neighborhood gossip that seemed to spread like wildfire in suburban communities. The pool itself was nothing extravagant by most standards, measuring about 24 feet long and 12 feet wide, with a shallow end that gradually sloped to a deep end of 8 feet. Tom had chosen natural stone coping and a dark liner that made the water appear almost black, giving it an elegant, understated appearance that complemented the mature oak and maple trees that surrounded his backyard. A small deck extended from the back of the house to the pool area, furnished with a simple table and chairs where Tom could enjoy his morning coffee while watching deer emerge from the woods to drink from the creek. For 2 peaceful years, Tom had enjoyed his private oasis swimming laps in the early morning before work and floating quietly in the evenings as a way to decompress from the stresses of law enforcement. His neighbors were friendly but not intrusive, respecting the privacy that his corner lot naturally provided. The only sounds that typically broke the tranquil atmosphere were the gentle bubbling of the waterfall feature and the occasional call of birds from the surrounding trees. Everything changed when Linda Patterson moved into the house directly across the street from Tom in the spring. Linda was a retired real estate agent in her early 60s who had sold her large family home after her divorce and downsized to a smaller property in what she considered a more manageable neighborhood. She arrived with strong opinions about property values, community standards, and what she perceived as the proper way to maintain a residential area. Within weeks of moving in, Linda had volunteered to join the Willowbrook Homeowners Association board and had begun making her presence known throughout the community. The HOA in Willowbrook was a relatively new organization that had been formed just 5 years earlier when a group of residents became concerned about a few properties that they felt were bringing down the overall appearance of the neighborhood. The association had modest power compared to some of the more restrictive communities in the area, focusing primarily on basic maintenance standards and architectural guidelines for major renovations. Most longtime residents like Tom paid their modest annual dues and rarely gave the organization much thought, as it seemed to operate mainly in the background, handling minor disputes and organizing the occasional neighborhood cleanup day. Linda, however, saw the HOA as an opportunity to implement her vision of what a proper suburban community should look like. She began attending every monthly meeting armed with a notebook full of observations about various properties and suggestions for new rules and regulations. Her background in real estate had given her strong opinions about curb appeal and property maintenance, and she was not shy about sharing these views with anyone who would listen. Some neighbors found her enthusiasm refreshing, while others began to view her with growing wariness as she appointed herself the unofficial watchdog of community standards. Tom first became aware of Linda's scrutiny on a Saturday morning in early June. He was doing routine maintenance on his pool. He had noticed her standing at the edge of her front yard, with what appeared to be a camera taking pictures in the direction of his property. When he walked to the front of his house to collect his mail, Linda approached him with a friendly smile that somehow managed to seem both welcoming and calculating at the same time. "Good morning, Sheriff Mitchell," she called out as she crossed the street, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness of someone who had spent years dealing with clients. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but I couldn't help but notice that lovely pool in your backyard. It's quite impressive, though, I have to admit. I was a bit surprised to see it there, since I don't recall seeing any notifications about pool construction in the HOA newsletters." Tom had paused with his mail in his hand, studying Linda's expression as he tried to gauge her intentions. He had dealt with enough difficult personalities in his line of work to recognize when someone was fishing for information or looking for reasons to create conflict. "The pool was installed about 3 years ago," he replied evenly, "long before you moved to the neighborhood. All the proper permits were obtained, and the work was done by licensed contractors." Linda nodded enthusiastically, as if his response had confirmed something she already suspected. "Oh, I'm sure everything was done properly," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that, as a new member of the HOA board, I've been reviewing our records and guidelines, and I noticed that there doesn't seem to be any documentation about pool installations in your file. I'm sure it's just an oversight, but we do like to keep thorough records for insurance purposes and property value assessments." The implication in her words was clear, though Tom chose to keep his response neutral. "As I mentioned, the pool was installed with all required permits through the county," he said. "If the HOA needs documentation for their files, they can request copies from the building department. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some work to finish before it gets too hot." Linda had smiled again, but Tom could see the wheels turning behind her eyes as she processed his somewhat dismissive response. "Of course," she said, taking a step back toward her own property. "I completely understand how busy you must be with your important work. We'll just make a note to follow up on the documentation. We all want to make sure everything is in proper order for the good of the community." That brief encounter had set the tone for what would become an increasingly tense relationship between Tom and his new neighbor. Over the following weeks, Linda began what could only be described as a campaign of passive-aggressive surveillance. She would happen to be working in her front garden whenever Tom came home from work, taking note of his schedule and activities. She began filing what she called courtesy notifications with the HOA about various minor issues around the neighborhood, most of which seemed to involve properties that belonged to residents who had not been particularly welcoming to her suggestions. For improvement, the pool became Linda's primary focus of attention. She claimed that the sound of the waterfall feature was disturbing her sleep, despite the fact that it was barely audible from the street, and certainly no louder than the natural sounds of the creek that ran behind the properties. She questioned whether the pool lighting met community standards, even though Tom used only subtle landscape lighting that was far less intrusive than many of his neighbors' elaborate security systems. Most significantly, she began researching HOA regulations and county codes with the determination of someone who believed she had found a violation that could be used to assert her authority. Tom tried to maintain his patience and professionalism in dealing with Linda's complaints, but he could feel his frustration growing with each petty notification that arrived in his mailbox. As sheriff, he dealt with real problems every day: domestic violence, drug trafficking, and serious crimes that affected the safety and well-being of the community. Coming home to find letters questioning the height of his pool fence or the brightness of his underwater lighting felt like a waste of everyone's time and energy.